Millionaire finds black girl and 2 babies in a park, without knowing they all his own babies. Next will shock you. Hey there, everyone. Welcome to the channel. Are you ready for a journey that'll keep you on the edge of your seat, heart racing with every twist and turn? If you think you've seen it all, think again. Because what's coming up will shock you, move you, and have you questioning everything you thought you knew about love, betrayal, and redemption. This is the kind of story that will have you hooked from the first minute. Now, I've got a question for you. Where are you watching me from? Drop your location in the comments and let me know if you're watching from across the globe, from your couch, or maybe from a cozy coffee shop. I'm dying to hear from you and know just how far this story is reaching. Let's get this conversation started. The sky wept quietly over the city as twilight surrendered to night, casting a silver haze over the park's empty walkways. Rain fell in soft, steady whispers, neither stormy nor gentle, just enough to stir forgotten memories and wash the world in sadness. Ethan Ward, a man of 30, stepped onto the cobbled path, his polished black shoes tapping softly against wet stone. He wore a tailored black suit that fit his tall frame like second skin, dark as the clouds above him, and his hand loosely held a closed umbrella, not minding the drizzle that kissed his face and soaked into his neatly styled chestnut hair. Most would avoid the park in such weather, but Ethan was not most men. He didn't know why his feet carried him here tonight. Perhaps it was the silence he craved, or the way the rain could hide a man's tears without asking questions. Ethan Ward was the kind of man people noticed. Billionaire, bachelor, clean-cut jawline, eyes the color of frozen oceans. But beneath the perfect image was a heart long frozen by regret, wounds hidden behind luxury. The world saw his success, but no one saw the invisible scars, the guilt that gripped him every time he stood still long enough to feel it. He strolled past the iron gate and into the park's heart, where lamplight flickered through tree branches and shadows moved like ghosts. That's when he saw them. At first, he thought it was a bundle of blankets abandoned beneath a twisted oak. But as he stepped closer, the image sharpened, and time seemed to stop. There, under the shelter of a worn blanket, soaked by the rain, curled a small black girl, no more than 7, with deep brown eyes closed and arms outstretched like a shield. Nestled against her chest were 2 younger children, twins, he guessed, barely toddlers, their tiny faces barely visible beneath the folds of wet fabric. She held them like a lioness guarding her cubs, her small body trembling but unmoving. Ethan's breath caught. His pulse slowed. The world blurred. What were children, babies, doing here, alone in the rain at this hour? The girl's face was tired, her lips chapped, her fingers clenched in resolve. She didn't look up, not even as Ethan slowly approached, every step unsure, as if afraid that moving too fast would break the fragile scene. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir inside him, a pull stronger than logic, deeper than pity. He crouched down, gently setting his umbrella aside, the rain now soaking his expensive suit. Hey there, he said softly, his voice rough, unused to such tenderness. Are you okay? The girl stirred, just slightly. One eye opened, a guarded, wild gaze that mirrored years of fear in a child too young to carry it. She didn't speak. She only tightened her grip on the babies, as though she thought he might take them away. It's all right, Ethan whispered. I won't hurt you. I promise. A flash of thunder rumbled in the distance. The little girl blinked, tears mixing with raindrops, but still said nothing. Ethan's eyes scanned their blanket, threadbare, barely enough to cover all three. No coats, no shoes on the toddlers, skin pale with cold. This wasn't a sad moment. It was tragic, and it tore something inside him. He looked around. No mother, no father, no stroller, no bags, nothing but these children, and the rain. His voice softened even more. "Are you alone out here?" The girl hesitated, then gave the tiniest nod. Ethan swallowed hard. "Do you have a name?" Still no answer. "I'm Ethan, Ethan Ward," he offered gently. "I know I'm a stranger, but I can help. You and your siblings." She flinched at the word, but didn't deny it. "I have a warm house, food, a fireplace, toys. You can all be safe there." "Just for tonight," he added, not wanting to frighten her with promises she wasn't ready to trust. She stared at him for a long time, longer than most adults could hold his gaze, and then finally nodded again. Ethan exhaled with a tremble. He slowly removed his coat and draped it over the three children. The fabric swallowed them, and for the first time, the girl relaxed a little. He carefully scooped the toddlers into his arms, and to his surprise, they clung to him as though he were familiar, as though his scent, his heartbeat, were already known. He paused, unsettled by the strange warmth in their tiny grips. The girl walked beside him, silent and soaked, holding the edge of his coat like an anchor. Back at the mansion, Ethan's staff scrambled in confusion as he entered with three drenched children in his arms and another by his side. He barked no orders, only whispered for warm towels, soup, blankets, soft things, quiet things. The little girl sat stiffly on the couch, watching every move with the eyes of someone who had seen too much. The toddlers slept peacefully, as though used to the cold, to being carried, to uncertainty. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study, fire crackling beside him, staring at the flames. Something about the girl haunted him. Her eyes, the shape of her face, her silence. A feeling nagged at him, too big to name. Morning came, and with it came answers that would shatter everything he thought he knew. The fire cracked softly in Ethan's study, painting flickering shadows across the marble floor and high ceilings of his mansion. He sat motionless in the leather armchair, elbows resting on his knees, his gaze lost in the dancing flames. Outside, dawn stretched its pale fingers across the sky, chasing away the rain. But inside, the storm still raged in his chest. The house was quiet, save for the occasional soft breath of sleeping children in the guest rooms upstairs. They were warm now, dry and safe. But the haunting image of them, huddled beneath that tree, forgotten by the world, wouldn't leave him. And neither would that feeling, that aching, unrelenting whisper that their faces weren't unfamiliar, especially the little girl. Her eyes had stirred something deep, something buried under years of denial. He rose from his seat and walked to the window, rain still clinging to the glass in slow-moving rivers. His reflection stared back at him, but for the first time in years he didn't recognize the man. He saw only questions, ghosts of a past he'd tried too hard to erase. And then, like a dam breaking, the memories began to pour in. It started with a laugh, soft, full of sunlight. Amara's laugh. It used to echo through this very house, lifting the cold from the walls, making it a home. She had a way of turning ordinary moments into magic. Ethan closed his eyes, the image of her spinning barefoot in the kitchen, flour on her cheeks, humming an old soul tune as she baked cornbread, flooding his mind. Her skin was the color of rich coffee, smooth and radiant, and her smile could undo even his worst days. She hadn't cared that he came from money, from fame. She saw the man beneath the title, and for a while that was enough. They had met at a gallery opening downtown. Ethan had been there on obligation, bored by the clinking glasses and hollow compliments. Amara was different. She hadn't even looked at the art, just the people. Her questions were bold, her presence magnetic. When she caught him staring, she called him out with a grin and said, "Don't look at me like you've never seen confidence before." He laughed. She walked away. He followed. That night they talked for hours on a rooftop bar, both surprised at how easily they unfolded to each other. She told him about her dreams of starting a non-profit for underprivileged mothers. He told her about the loneliness of his wealth, how money filled his hands, but never his heart. She teased him for being too poetic. He loved that. Their relationship was intense. They were fire and gravity, drawn to each other despite the burn. His world of black-tie events and hers of spoken-word cafes clashed beautifully. Ethan found himself skipping meetings just to watch her paint or volunteer with her at shelters. Amara was a force of nature, unapologetically passionate, fiercely kind, and stubborn as hell. When she loved, it was with everything. And she loved him, fully, deeply, foolishly. For a while, that love transformed him. His cold mansion grew warmer. The staff smiled more. Ethan smiled more. They danced in the living room, cooked terrible meals, kissed like teenagers in public just to make strangers blush. But the world didn't stop watching. His parents disapproved quietly at first, then loudly. The media, once obsessed with his lifestyle, turned cruel. Headlines screamed, "Billionaire rebel dates charity girl from the other side of town." His board members whispered about appearances, maintaining brand integrity. Friends ghosted, investors pulled back, and through it all, Amara stood tall. "They don't scare me," she said, hand in his. "But do they scare you?" Ethan never answered that question. Not truly. He tried to shield her from it all, but deep down he began to fracture. The pressure mounted. The board demanded he distance himself. His father reminded him of the empire at stake. The whispers became commands. And worst of all, Ethan began to believe them. Not because Amara wasn't enough, but because he wasn't strong enough to deserve her. When she got pregnant, it should have been the happiest moment of their lives. Instead, it terrified him. What would the world say now? A black woman, unmarried, carrying the heirs to $1 billion name. It wasn't the children he feared. It was the headlines, the judgment, the fall from grace. He hated himself for it. Amara sensed the change. She always did. She confronted him one rainy night, her hand on her belly, eyes burning. "Say it," she demanded. "If you're ashamed of me, say it. If you don't want this, say it now." Ethan couldn't. He looked away, and that silence was louder than any scream. They separated shortly after. Amara left without drama, just tears. She left the mansion, the life, the name, and she never looked back. He tried, months later, to find her, but she'd vanished. No forwarding address, no phone. She had hidden her life from him as if he never existed. And maybe, in some ways, he didn't deserve to. Ethan buried himself in work, women, distractions. But nothing filled the ache. At night, He'd stare at the ceiling and wonder what their child looked like. Boy or girl? Did they laugh like Amara? Did they know his name? The guilt gnawed at him, and still he did nothing. Now, standing here, years later, with 3 children asleep under his roof, Ethan felt that old weight return with crushing force. The little girl's eyes, the toddler's familiarity, the way they clung to him. They weren't strangers. They couldn't be. And suddenly, the timelines aligned in his mind like puzzle pieces snapping into place. If she was pregnant 8 years ago, if these children were around 7, he stumbled backward, breathless, heart hammering. No, he whispered, but the truth had already rooted itself. They were his. All 3 of them. And she had never told him. Or maybe he never gave her the chance. Ethan stood in the middle of his study, breath shallow, chest tight, like the air itself had turned to ice. His hands trembled, though the fire still burned in the hearth. Amara's voice echoed through his mind. Not a memory this time, but something closer, something spiritual. If you're ashamed of me, say it. Her eyes flashed behind his eyelids, and he could almost feel her standing beside him, her belly full, her voice breaking, her soul begging him to fight for her. But he hadn't. That silence he'd given her on that stormy night wasn't just a pause, it was a death sentence for everything they had built together. The crack hadn't started then, but that moment was when it shattered entirely. And now, years later, the pieces had found their way back, jagged and sharp, in the form of 3 innocent children who didn't even know his name. He couldn't stay still. He needed answers, even if they hurt. He stormed out of the study and climbed the stairs, his feet heavy, his heart heavier. The hallway was dim, the only light seeping from the cracked door of the guest room. He pushed it open gently and saw them, his children. The twins were asleep, small hands curled into fists, breathing peacefully for perhaps the first time in days. The little girl was sitting upright now, back against the headboard, arms around her knees, staring out the window. She turned slowly as he entered, eyes still wary, still guarded. She looked so much like Amara, it punched the breath from his lungs. The shape of her face, the curve of her lips, even the way she tilted her head. So familiar. It was painful. "Can we talk?" he asked softly, standing at the edge of the room like an intruder in his own life. She nodded, just once, cautious but curious. He sat on the edge of a small armchair across from her and leaned forward. "I need to ask, what's your name?" She hesitated, then said, "Aliyah." The name struck him like thunder. Amara had once told him that if they had a daughter, she wanted to name her Aliyah, because she'll rise, no matter how far she falls. He had laughed, said it sounded poetic. Amara had smiled and said, "Then you know she'll survive." His eyes welled up. He didn't even try to hide it. "And your brothers?" he asked. Aliyah glanced at the sleeping boys. "Amir and Elijah," she said. Ethan broke. Those names, he'd heard them before, in a dream, in passing thoughts. Amara had chosen names filled with grace and faith and strength, and he hadn't been there for any of it. Not the birth, not the sleepless nights, not the scraped knees or the bedtime stories. He had missed it all. And for what? To protect a company? A legacy built on loneliness? Aliyah watched him cry without unflinching. "Did you know my mum?" she asked quietly, her voice a blade of soft truth. Ethan looked up, his lips trembling. "Yes," he whispered. "I knew her. I loved her." Aliyah blinked slowly, as if processing that truth. "She used to talk about someone," she said. someone she missed. She never said his name, but sometimes she'd cry when she thought we were asleep. Ethan clenched his fists, the guilt crawling up his spine like fire ants. She left everything, Aaliyah said, to keep us safe. She said no one wanted us, not even our dad. That sentence broke something permanent in Ethan. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. No defense, no excuse, because it was true. He hadn't wanted them. Or rather, he hadn't allowed himself to want them. The truth was worse than a lie. I didn't know, he finally choked. I didn't know she was pregnant. I didn't know where she went. I tried to find her, but... He stopped. Even to his own ears, it sounded weak. She died last month, Aaliyah said bluntly, eyes on the floor. She got sick, and we had no money. She told me to take care of them if anything happened. So, I did. Ethan buried his face in his hands. He had failed them all. And then, like the sting of salt on a wound, his mind dragged him backward. To that night, the night he walked away. Amara had stood in the doorway of their bedroom, eyes swollen, holding an ultrasound photo in one hand and a letter in the other. It's triplets, she said softly. 3 heartbeats. Ethan had frozen. Not one child. 3. His fear multiplied instantly, along with the voices of his father, the board, the media. Amara's voice cracked through his panic. I'm not asking you to give up everything. I'm asking you to choose me, us. He couldn't speak. Not then. He had stared at the photo, then at her, and something in his silence had made her crumble. She set the picture down on the bed and walked out. That night, she left. She never came back. He could have gone after her. He should have. But instead, he let pride win. He convinced himself it was for the best, that she'd be fine, that she was strong. But strength doesn't make pain disappear. It just makes it quieter. Now, years later, as he looked at the children she left behind, the children he left behind, Ethan realized he had never been strong. He had just been afraid. And cowardice had cost him everything. He stood, slowly, and approached Aaliyah. She tensed. I'm not going to take you away from them, she said quickly. They're mine to protect. Ethan dropped to his knees before her. You've done more protecting in 7 years than I've done in a lifetime, he said, voice breaking. I don't deserve you, any of you, but I want to try. Aaliyah didn't answer. She looked past him, at her brothers, at the world beyond the window. Rain had stopped. A quiet sunrise touched the sky. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then she spoke. If you hurt them, I'll never forgive you. Ethan nodded. I wouldn't forgive myself either. And so began the long road to redemption, not paved with grand gestures, but quiet promises, tear-stained confessions, late-night lullabies sung by a father who was learning everything from scratch. But before healing, there had to be reckoning. And Ethan Ward had a lifetime of pain to face. The room had quieted, but inside Ethan a storm still churned, one made not of wind or rain, but memory and regret, crashing like thunder against the walls of his conscience. He stayed on his knees long after Aaliyah stopped speaking, her words echoing through him like a mantra. If you hurt them, I'll never forgive you. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning, a vow wrapped in the raw, small voice of a girl who had carried the weight of a mother's love and a father's absence far too early. And yet, even in her fear, she gave him a chance, a flicker of trust through the bruised glass of her soul. Ethan stood slowly, his legs stiff, heart heavier than it had ever been, and turned back toward the hallway, leaving the door open just enough so they would know. He was still there. He wasn't running anymore. Back in his study, he poured a drink, but couldn't bring himself to lift it. The tumbler of scotch trembled in his hand, like a lie he could no longer swallow. He set it down and walked to the cabinet where he kept the one box he hadn't opened in 8 years, the one labelled her. Inside was every letter Amara had written to him while they were together, notes she left on his pillow, birthday cards with hand-drawn hearts, and the sketch she once made of the two of them sitting beneath a sycamore tree. His throat tightened. But beneath it all, folded and slightly torn, was the letter she had left the night she disappeared. He had never opened it, not because he forgot, but because he was afraid of what it would say. That he was the villain, that she hated him, that he had lost her forever. But now, as the quiet weight of 3 sleeping children filled his home, he realized the only truth he feared more than reading her words was never knowing them. His fingers trembled as he broke the seal and unfolded the paper, the ink slightly smudged, as though her tears had bled into the lines. "Ethan," it began, "if you're reading this, I've already gone. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. You made your choice when you let the world be louder than our love. I waited for you to speak. I waited for you to fight. But silence speaks too, and yours said everything. I'm not running from you. I'm running toward our children, because they need love without conditions. They need a life without shame. And I don't want them growing up in a house where they feel like secrets. I wish you had come with us. I wish you had looked at me that night and said, 'Yes, I choose you.' But you didn't. And so I'll carry the memory of us in my bones, and I'll teach them what love should be, even if I have to do it alone." Ethan's tears fell freely now, silent and searing. He had told himself she left because she didn't want the pressure, the money, the scrutiny. But the truth, she left because she loved them enough to leave him, because he had made her feel like a burden in the very moment she needed to feel like a blessing. He pressed the letter to his chest and collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing into the silence. He remembered the months after she left, how he kept her absence buried under board meetings and public smiles. But behind closed doors, he would stare at the empty pillow beside him and wonder if she ever thought of him. He had tried to find her, but not hard enough. A single private investigator. 1 week. No results. He told himself she didn't want to be found. And maybe she didn't. Or maybe she was waiting for him to fight harder, to prove she mattered more than reputation, more than wealth. But he had failed the test, and the cost was incalculable. The following days blurred into a routine Ethan never imagined. Early mornings making breakfast badly, learning how the twins liked their oatmeal plain, and Aliyah liked hers with cinnamon. He drove them to the park, sat on benches watching them play, feeling the strangest ache of pride and pain twist together in his chest. They were so beautiful, so full of life. And they didn't yet know how broken their beginnings were. Every night he read to them from Amara's favorite children's books. He found a few in their bag, worn and taped at the edges. He recognized the titles. She used to read them to him in funny voices, long before they ever imagined they'd have kids of their own. He found himself doing the same, and to his surprise, the children laughed, especially Aliyah, though she tried not to. Slowly, walls began to crumble. They were cautious, but curious, unsure, but not unwilling. Trust was forming, not in leaps, but in glances, in the way Aaliyah started to leave her door open at night, in the way Amir clutched his hand during storms, in the way Elijah smiled wider every morning. But healing is not a straight road. One night, Ethan found Aaliyah in the study, holding a photo of Amara. She looked up, eyes wet. "Do you still love her?" she asked. Ethan nodded, his voice caught. "Every day." She looked back at the photo. "She was sad a lot," she said, "but she never said your name, not even when she was dying." Ethan's heart shattered again. "She wanted to protect you," he whispered. Aaliyah looked at him, something breaking in her own voice now. "Then why didn't you protect her?" He had no answer, but that night he knelt beside her and told her everything. The truth about the fear, the failure, the silence that killed their love. And she listened, not as a child, but as someone who had carried the consequences of adult decisions too long. When he finished, she looked at him and said, "Don't lie to them, not even when it's hard." And he promised. Right then and there, he swore to rebuild what he had broken, not with money, but with presence, with honesty, with love. And as he tucked the twins in, as he kissed their small foreheads and whispered good night, he felt it. Amara's spirit in the quiet corners of the room, watching, maybe even smiling. And he whispered back, "I'm sorry, but I'm here now." And for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The whisper hung in the air, like the final note of a song that had taken years to finish. "I'm sorry, but I'm here now." Ethan stood in the doorway of the twins' room, watching the steady rise and fall of their tiny chests, his hand still warm from the gentle brush of their foreheads. For the first time since Amara had vanished, the silence in his house wasn't crushing. It was calming. There was peace in the stillness, like the world had paused to let him breathe again, to allow space for this fragile new beginning. Yet just beneath that peace, he felt a quiet urgency, a stirring in his soul, telling him that the storm wasn't over. It was only just beginning. He walked softly down the hallway, passing Aaliyah's door. It was slightly ajar, the sliver of light from her nightstand lamp casting a line across the hardwood floor. He paused. She was still awake, curled in a blanket, holding the photo of Amara again. He didn't enter, but he whispered, "Good night, Aaliyah." She didn't respond, but he caught the flicker of her eyes shifting toward him. That was enough. For now, downstairs, the house felt too big again, the luxury of it all suddenly hollow in contrast to the warmth of his children's laughter. He walked to the living room, where the fire had long since faded, and threw in another log, watching as flames rose and danced like they had something to celebrate. His mind wandered to Amara, how she used to curl up with a book by the fire, how she always said autumn smelled like poetry. He closed his eyes, letting the scent of burning pine fill his lungs, and remembered the first time he met her. It was a bookstore. Rain tapping on the windows. She had been crouched on the floor, flipping through a vintage collection of love letters. Their eyes had met, and for the first time, the world had felt quiet. Not empty, not lonely, just quiet. They talked for hours that day. She had laughed at his formal tone, called him Mr. Millionaire before she even knew who he was. He had been smitten. No woman had ever looked at him like she wasn't impressed, like she wanted to understand him, not own him, not expose him, just see him. And Amara had seen everything. That had been the start of everything. but it had also been the seed of what broke them, the way the world refused to allow their love to simply exist. He reached for the small, leather-bound journal Amara once gave him, blank pages meant for dreams, for goals. He had never written in it, but now, for the first time, he opened to the first page and wrote, "Day 1. I saw her in them. I saw her in Aliyah's defiance, in Amir's gentleness, in Elijah's smile. I didn't know how much of her I was missing until I looked into their eyes and saw her again." The ink bled slightly from the pressure of his grip. He hadn't realized he was crying again. Grief, it seemed, didn't come in waves. It came in fragments, in quiet ambushes, in the way a laugh could break you, or a color could unravel you. And as he wrote, the thunder rolled outside, distant, but warning. A storm was coming. By morning, the world outside had turned grey. Rain lashed the windows, and wind howled through the trees. But inside, the house was alive with the sound of cereal bowls clinking, cartoons humming, and Elijah's tiny voice asking why lightning was loud like Daddy's footsteps. Aliyah was dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with her arms crossed, like a silent judge. Ethan had made pancakes. They were slightly burnt, but the twins didn't care. They giggled and dipped them in syrup with sticky hands and faces. Aliyah just stared. He sat across from her, his smile nervous. "You don't like pancakes?" he asked. She shrugged. "You always make them wrong," she said. Ethan tilted his head. "Always?" She blinked. "That's what Mama used to say, when she talked about you." His breath caught. It was the first time she'd referred to Amara in the past tense. It felt like a dagger and a gift all at once. He nodded slowly. "She wasn't wrong," he said. "I messed up a lot of things." Later that day, as the storm worsened, Ethan heard the sound he feared most, his phone buzzing with an urgent tone. A call from his assistant. "There's a situation," she said. "Someone's leaked a photo of you with the children. There's speculation everywhere. News outlets are running with it. Rumors, headlines, some saying you adopted homeless children, others—" She trailed off. Ethan could guess the rest. Illegitimate children. Secret family. Corporate scandal. The world didn't care about truth. It cared about stories. And the story of a millionaire with 3 black children would write itself in ways that had nothing to do with love. He turned on the TV. And there it was, his face, a photo of him in the park with Aliyah and the twins. The headline, "Ethan Ward's Secret Family." Mystery children spark controversy. He felt bile rise in his throat, not because of the speculation, but because the world was already doing to them what it had once done to Amara, twisting love into shame. The children didn't know yet, but they would. And he had to be ready. He paced the hallway, rage simmering. He thought about the board, the shareholders, the vultures who would use this against him. But none of it mattered. Not anymore. Only they mattered. And when Aliyah wandered into the room, eyes curious, holding the remote, he knelt beside her and took her hand. "People are going to talk," he said. "About me, about you, about your mom. And most of it won't be true. But I promise you, no matter what they say, I'm never going to let anyone hurt you." She looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether to believe him. Then, slowly, she handed him the remote and said, "Then tell them who we are. All of us." And that night, Ethan stood in front of cameras for the first time, not as a CEO or a businessman, but as a father. He told the world about Amara, about their love, about the children he didn't know he had, and the mistakes that cost him the chance to hold them as infants. He told the world he wasn't ashamed. He told them about Aaliyah's courage, about Amir's kindness, about Elijah's laughter. He cried. And the world listened. And though the media twisted and turned it into headlines, somewhere in the chaos, truth found its voice. When he came home that night, the lights were off, but on the hallway wall, taped in childish handwriting, was a note. You told the truth. That means something. And beneath it, a drawing, 4 stick figures holding hands, 1 tall, 3 small. A heart above them all. Ethan touched the note, a tear sliding down his cheek. And in that moment, he knew. The storm could rage outside, but in here, within these walls, within these hearts, a fire had been lit, and he would never let it go out. Ethan stood still, his hand gently pressing the note to his chest. The crayon-scribbled words were as fragile as the moment. You told the truth. That means something. His children, his real children, had entrusted him with their faith in a way he had never known before, and for the first time in years his heart felt whole, or at least on the path toward healing. Yet as he stood there, the shadows of his past loomed closer, encroaching on the fragile peace he had just begun to form with Aaliyah, Amir, and Elijah. The storm outside had subsided, but inside a new storm was beginning to take shape, one that involved more than just protecting his family from the outside world. It was a storm of reconciling the man he had been with the man he wanted to become. The phone rang again, cutting through the quiet. This time, it was his father. Ethan hesitated before answering, knowing that this conversation would change everything. His father, a man of wealth and influence, had disapproved of his marriage to Amara from the start. He had viewed her as an obstacle, a distraction, a complication to Ethan's carefully structured life. They hadn't spoken in over 3 years, since Ethan had left the family estate to marry her. He had tried reaching out to his father after the divorce, but each attempt had been met with silence or curt responses. He had grown accustomed to the absence. But now the call came with a weight, one that felt too heavy to ignore. "Ethan," his father's voice crackled through the receiver, stern and sharp as ever. Yet there was something else underneath it, a tremor, a hint of concern. "I saw the news. Are you out of your mind? What are you doing? You're ruining everything we've built. You and your children. What's next? A public spectacle?" Ethan's grip tightened on the phone, the words of his father coming at him like daggers, each one aimed at the fragile confidence he had fought to build over the last few days. But he held his ground, even if only in his own mind. "Dad," he said quietly, "it's not a spectacle. These children, they're my children. They're my responsibility. And I'm not going to hide them. I'm not going to apologize for them. They're my family, and I'm going to make sure they have a life worth living, a life full of love." There was a pause on the other end, long enough for Ethan to feel the weight of his father's judgment. Finally, his father spoke again, his tone cooler now. "I raised you to be a man of ambition, Ethan, a man who controlled his life, who built something. You're nothing without that control. And now, you're letting emotions, children, your ex-wife, ruin everything you've worked for. How are you going to explain this to your board, to your investors, to your employees?" The question stung, not because it wasn't valid, but because it revealed the chasm between the life his father valued and the life Ethan now sought to build. "I'm not nothing, Dad," Ethan said, his voice more forceful now. "And I'm not going to sacrifice them. Not for anything. I've spent too many years sacrificing myself, my love, my happiness, for nothing. So if you think I'm going to turn my back on them to keep this charade going, you're wrong. I'm done. I'm doing this my way now." Another silence, but this one felt different. His father's words, once a constant presence, no longer held the power they once did. He had been a prisoner of his father's expectations for too long, and now, with Aliyah, Amir, and Elijah depending on him, Ethan felt something stirring inside him. Something solid, something that didn't bend to anyone's rules. "If you can't accept that, then maybe it's time for us to move on," he finished, his voice steady. His father's response was barely a whisper, but it carried more weight than any of his usual commands. "I don't agree with you, but you're a grown man. I can't stop you from making your own mistakes." And with that, the conversation ended. Ethan put the phone down, his heart racing, but something else had shifted inside him. A realization that for the first time in his life, his father's opinion no longer had the power to break him. He wasn't the same man he had been, and the future he envisioned no longer relied on pleasing his father or society's expectations. It was about the children now, about giving them the love and stability that had been denied to them. They were his legacy. The following morning, Ethan gathered the children in the living room for a family meeting, a gesture so simple, yet one that had never occurred to him in his past. He stood before them, the gravity of his words hanging heavy in the air. "Listen," he began, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "I know things have been confusing. I know you've been through a lot. And I want to make sure you understand something. I'm not going anywhere. You're my family now. And no matter what happens, I'm here. And I'll always be here." Aliyah, her arms crossed as usual, glanced at him with a quiet intensity. "You really mean that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You won't leave us?" Ethan's heart cracked, but he smiled, crouching down to her level. "I'll never leave you. Not now, not ever. I promise." Amir and Elijah, both much younger, didn't fully grasp the weight of the conversation, but they smiled nonetheless, as though they could sense the truth in their father's words. Ethan's gaze softened as he looked at them, his chest swelling with a love he had never thought possible. They were his, all of them, and he would protect them from the world that would try to tear them apart. But there was something else he knew deep in his bones, something he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. His past, his legacy, the company he had built. It was all tied together in ways he hadn't understood before. And the battle he had fought with his father, the boardroom, and his own sense of self was far from over. But the difference now was that he didn't care about the world's approval anymore. For the first time, he cared about building a future, one filled with love, honesty, and the unwavering bond of family. And no matter the storm that came their way, no matter the obstacles, he was ready to face them, for he knew that this time he would not be fighting alone. The house felt different now, even though nothing had physically changed. The air inside was warmer somehow, charged with a newfound energy, like the first stirrings of spring after a long, cold winter. Ethan stood by the window, gazing out at the sprawling garden beyond, lost in thought. His promise to Aliyah, Amir, and Elijah still resonated in his chest like the beat of a drum, steady and unyielding. He had spoken those words to them, those simple but weighty words of devotion, and now it was time to act. But even as he made that vow, he knew that the road ahead would not be smooth. The world was watching, and it had never been kinder to the rich, the powerful, or the misunderstood. It had never been kind to those who dared to step outside its rigid boundaries, to those who defied expectations, who broke from tradition and built something new. And yet, for the first time in years, Ethan didn't care. The weight of his father's disapproval, the pressure from his board, the harsh glare of the media, none of it mattered. What mattered was the quiet comfort of his children's laughter in the next room. What mattered was the tenderness in Alia's eyes when she looked at him, the trust slowly beginning to form between them, fragile but real. What mattered was Amir's quiet smile, the way he reached for his hand when the storm outside rattled the windows. What mattered was Elijah, whose wide eyes followed him wherever he went, like a little boy who saw the world through the lens of awe and wonder. That was his family. They were his purpose now, and they would be the foundation of everything he built from this moment forward. But reality was insistent. The phone rang again, and this time it was a call from his lawyer, a voice as sharp and practiced as ever. "Ethan," she began. No pleasantries, just the cold, immediate issue at hand. "We've had a call from the press, and the story's gaining more traction than we anticipated. It's no longer just a curiosity. It's a full-fledged media circus. You need to address this, or it's going to spin out of control. The public is looking for answers. Your board's already getting nervous." Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes flickering to the photos of his family hanging on the wall. "I don't care about the board," he said, his voice firm. "I don't care about the media. I care about my children, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect them." His words were calm, but inside, a storm was brewing. It wasn't just about protecting them from the world. It was about protecting them from the mistakes he'd made, the choices that had cost him so much, the time he could never get back. The guilt gnawed at him, a constant, unrelenting presence, but he had no choice now but to keep moving forward. He would make this right. For them. The lawyer sighed on the other end, the sound heavy with the weight of experience. "Ethan, I understand, but the public's perception is everything. You have to take control of this narrative before it takes control of you. I suggest you make a statement. Clear, decisive. Let people know who you are, who they are. This will shape the way people see you and your company for years to come. The longer you wait, the more speculation will build." Ethan hung up the phone with a mix of frustration and resolve. He knew she was right. The storm was no longer just an external threat. It was personal. His private life had become the public's obsession, and that was something he hadn't fully realized until now. Every moment he spent in the quiet comfort of his home with his children felt like a fleeting luxury, a brief reprieve from the world's ever-watchful eyes. But soon, that peace would be shattered. It was time to face the truth. He couldn't hide anymore, not from his past, not from the media, and not from his own children. That evening, Ethan called a press conference. The reporters were clamoring for answers, the camera flashes nearly blinding as he stepped onto the stage. His heart pounded in his chest, but he stood tall, determined to show the world the man he had become. not the man they had tried to paint him as. He began speaking, his voice steady but firm, every word carefully chosen. I know there has been a lot of speculation about my personal life, about the children I've recently introduced to the world. And I'm here to tell you the truth. These children are mine. They are not a publicity stunt, nor are they a product of some misguided attempt to control my image. They are my family, my flesh and blood, and I will do whatever it takes to protect them. Aliyah, Amir, and Elijah were sitting in the front row of the conference hall, the weight of the moment hanging heavy between them. Aliyah looked up at him, her expression unreadable. He could see the way her eyes flickered with uncertainty, the burden of public scrutiny already starting to weigh on her. She wasn't a child anymore. She understood the consequences of his actions, and for a brief moment he could feel the distance between them, the emotional wall that had formed overnight as the world dug its claws into their lives. But there was something else there, too, a glimmer of trust, a flicker of hope. She was still his daughter. They were still a family. That was enough. The cameras flashed again, questions firing at him from every direction. Mr. Ward, do you plan to give up control of your company for your children? Is this an attempt to salvage your reputation after the failed marriage? Are you prepared for the backlash this could cause? Ethan's answers were measured, but his resolve never wavered. This isn't about saving my reputation. This is about doing what's right. And what's right is putting my children first. I've spent too long focusing on things that don't matter, and now I'm ready to build a life that does. As he left the press conference, the weight of the moment began to settle over him. There was no going back now. The world had seen him for what he was. Flawed, but real. And that, he realized, was the beginning of something beautiful. Aliyah, Amir, and Elijah followed him out of the hall, and as they stepped into the cool evening air, Ethan felt a sense of calm he hadn't known in years. The battle was far from over, but for the first time he felt like he was on the right side of it. With his children by his side, there was nothing he couldn't face. He had everything he needed now, his family, and that would be enough to rebuild the life they deserved. The days that followed the press conference were a whirlwind, but somehow the quiet moments felt even louder. Ethan sat in his study late at night, staring at the files stacked high in front of him, his mind far from the business that demanded his attention. The weight of the world pressed down on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. His phone buzzed relentlessly, the inbox of his email filled with demands for interviews, statements, and responses to growing public speculation. His publicist's voice echoed in his head, her usual calm demeanor now laced with urgency, telling him to stay on message and keep control of the narrative. But none of it had mattered. The cameras, the interviews, the endless stream of media inquiries, they were all distractions. None of it could change the fact that Aliyah, Amir, and Elijah were now his world. He glanced at the family photos that adorned the walls of his office, their smiling faces staring back at him. It felt surreal, the life he had once known so far removed from the life he was now building. And yet, somehow, it was more real than anything he had ever experienced. The love he felt for these children was undeniable. But so was the weight of the responsibility. They weren't just his children. They were his redemption. In their eyes, he saw the chance to rewrite the mistakes of his past, to show them a future that wasn't shaped by broken promises, shame, or secrets. But that promise was already being tested. His father's disdain for the situation had only deepened in the wake of the press conference. Ethan hadn't heard from him since, but the silence spoke volumes. He knew what was coming. His father would make his displeasure known in the most public way possible, leveraging his wealth and influence to make sure Ethan felt the consequences of his decisions. The media hadn't been much kinder. The backlash had been swift, and the judgment cruel. Some had praised his honesty, his commitment to his children, but others had found it easier to paint him as a man desperate for redemption, willing to exploit his children for sympathy. The questions about his past marriage, about his ex-wife, Amara, had resurfaced, dragging up painful memories Ethan had buried long ago. It was a battle he wasn't sure he could win, facing the judgment of strangers who didn't know him, didn't understand him, didn't care to. His children, though, they were the ones who kept him grounded. It was their smiles, their laughter, their unconditional love that reminded him why he had taken this step in the first place. He had promised them a future, a safe space to grow, to be themselves. But even as the weeks passed, there were moments of doubt. Would Aaliyah, Amir, and Elijah ever fully accept him as their father? Would they understand that his choice wasn't just about them, but about a man finally realizing the gravity of his past mistakes? He had been so consumed by ambition, by the need to prove himself to his father, to his company, that he had lost sight of what really mattered. And now, here he was, trying to make amends. The nights were the hardest. Alone in his room, the weight of everything settled over him like a suffocating blanket. His thoughts would drift back to the years he spent with Amara, the dreams they had shared, and the love that once seemed so endless. They had been a young couple, full of promise, but life and ambition had torn them apart. He had been so consumed by his father's expectations, by the pressure to succeed, that he had forgotten how to love her the way she needed. And in the end, she had left. The divorce had been messy, filled with pain, and Amara had kept their children from him, hiding them away. The news of her death had hit him harder than he had admitted. It was a crushing blow, one that shattered the remnants of hope he had clung to. And now, standing in the wreckage of his past, he had the chance to make it right with his children. But the guilt lingered, a constant presence. Was he doing enough? Was it too late to rebuild the connection he had lost? Would his children ever forgive him for his absence in their lives? Aaliyah's gaze often haunted him. At 15, she was no longer the carefree little girl she had once been. There was a distance in her eyes, a maturity that didn't belong to a child. She had lived through pain that he had unknowingly inflicted. The walls she had built around herself were tall, impenetrable. It broke his heart to see her so guarded, so wary of the love he now offered. He didn't expect things to change overnight, but the longing for a connection was suffocating. She didn't trust him yet, and he understood that. Trust had to be earned. Amir, on the other hand, was still young enough to look at Ethan with untainted eyes, the innocence of childhood still shining through. He would run to him with a smile, eager for Ethan's attention, his small hands reaching up for guidance, for love. In those moments, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. There was still time with Amir. There was still a chance to show him the love that had been absent for too long. Elijah, the baby of the family, was the wild card. At just 3 years old, he understood the world in his own way, a way that was unfiltered and raw. He wasn't concerned with the past or the future. He simply wanted love, security, and attention. He was a reflection of the innocence Ethan had once lost, and it filled him with both joy and sorrow. But despite the deepening bond with his children, Ethan knew that nothing in life came without its sacrifices. His company had begun to show cracks, his business ventures uncertain as board members questioned his priorities. Ethan had always been the rock of his empire, the leader who made decisions with unwavering certainty. But now, with his focus split between his children and his career, doubts were creeping in. Would his company survive this personal crisis? Would he be able to hold everything together? He had given up so much already. His marriage, his relationship with his father, his place in the corporate world. He couldn't afford to lose more. As if to answer that question, the phone rang again, and this time it was from the board. He took a deep breath before answering, bracing himself for what was to come. "Mr. Ward," the voice on the other end began, cold and businesslike, "we need to discuss the future of the company. You're going to have to make some decisions soon about your priorities." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. The pressure was mounting, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure how much more he could bear. As he hung up the phone, the weight of the choices before him became clearer. He couldn't go back. Not now. Not when he had finally found what he had been searching for all these years. A family, a purpose, a reason to live beyond ambition and success. But the path ahead was fraught with obstacles. He had to make decisions about his company, his future, and the children who had come into his life at the most unexpected of times. Could he juggle it all? Could he truly create the life they all deserved? Or would he be forced to choose between the life he had always known and the family he was building from the ashes of his past? The next few days passed in a blur, each one blending into the next, with a steady rhythm of business meetings, media inquiries, and the quiet moments at home that still felt so foreign to Ethan. Every night he would sit alone in his office, the weight of the world pressing down on him, his thoughts constantly racing. It wasn't just about the company anymore. It wasn't about proving to his father that he could be the man he expected him to be. It wasn't about navigating the constant pressure of the board or the unrelenting glare of the media. No. Now it was about something much more complex, much more personal. It was about the future he had promised to his children, the future he didn't yet know how to give them. He had been blind to the way they had grown up without him. And now he was desperately trying to catch up, to bridge the gap that had formed during the years he'd been absent. But no matter how hard he tried, there were walls, high, impenetrable walls, that stood between them. Aaliyah was the hardest, always distant, always guarded. At 15, she was no longer the carefree girl he remembered from his brief time with Amara, and the hurt in her eyes when she looked at him spoke volumes. She wasn't sure whether she could trust him, whether she could forgive him for the years he had missed, and that uncertainty haunted him. How could he ever make up for that? How could he rebuild a relationship that had been fractured beyond recognition? As much as he longed for the warmth of her love, he couldn't force it. And in the silence that stretched between them, Ethan's mind wandered back to the years with Amara, to the days when they had once dreamed of building a life together. He had never once imagined that he would be standing here, a man broken by his own failures, trying to pick up the pieces of a life that had slipped through his fingers. He had loved Amara once, but somewhere along the way, the ambition had overtaken the love. His father's expectations, the pressure to succeed in the corporate world, it all had consumed him. And now, in the quiet of his office, Ethan knew that he had lost more than just his marriage. He had lost the family he had wanted. The guilt twisted inside of him like a constant ache, gnawing at him, reminding him of the man he could have been. And then there was his company, which had started to unravel in his absence. He hadn't expected it to be easy, but the cracks were widening faster than he had anticipated. His decision to step back, to prioritize his children over his career, had already begun to raise questions among the board members. The CEO was pressing for more involvement. The quarterly reports showed stagnation, and worst of all, whispers had begun to circulate about Ethan's commitment to the company. He had tried to balance both worlds, but it felt like walking a tightrope with no safety net beneath him. His team expected him to lead, to push them to new heights, but his heart was no longer in the game. His focus was divided, and the cracks were beginning to show. The phone rang, its shrill tone breaking his reverie, and he didn't need to check the caller ID to know who it was. It was his father. He had been waiting for this call, and yet, when it came, Ethan's heart still sank. "Ethan," his father's voice echoed through the receiver, cool and composed as always. "I've seen your little press stunt. You've made your choice, and now you have to live with it." The words cut through him, a harsh reminder of the man who had always expected perfection, who had never understood Ethan's desire to carve out his own path. "I'm doing what's best for my family," Ethan replied, his voice tight but resolute. "What you think doesn't matter anymore. I'm not going to sacrifice them for this company." His father's chuckle was low and patronizing. "You've always been good at making excuses, Ethan. But this is different. You can't escape the reality of what's happening here. You think you're doing the right thing, but you're throwing everything away. You've always been weak when it mattered." The words stung, but Ethan refused to let them get to him. He had heard it all before, the criticisms, the expectations, the constant reminders that nothing he did was ever good enough. "I'm not weak," Ethan said, his voice firm. "But I've learned that there's more to life than chasing power and approval. I won't be like you." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then his father's voice came through, colder than ever. "Then you've made your choice, son. Don't come crawling back when it all falls apart." The line went dead, and Ethan sat in the silence that followed, the weight of his father's words hanging in the air. It wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration of war. And for the first time, Ethan realized that he might have to choose between his family and the company that had once been his entire world. Would he give up everything he had worked for? Could he walk away from the empire he had built with his own hands? It was a question that didn't have an easy answer, and it haunted him. Meanwhile, at home, Aliyah had become more withdrawn, spending most of her time in her room, the door shut tight. Ethan had tried to reach out to her, to offer his support, but every attempt had been met with cold indifference. It hurt him more than he could put into words. He wasn't sure how to fix it, or even if he could. Amir and Elijah, on the other hand, were still eager to spend time with him. Amir, at least, seemed to want to build a bond. He would sit with Ethan in the evenings, drawing pictures or talking about his day at school. But Aliyah, she was a different story. She didn't need him, not like they did, and that reality was hard to swallow. The storm was coming. Ethan could feel it in the air, could sense the tension building. His past was closing in on him, his father's anger, the media's judgment, the instability of his company. All of it was starting to converge. And as he looked at the faces of his children, the weight of his choices became even more pressing. He had to find a way to make this work. For them. He couldn't afford to lose them, too. The days that followed the call from his father were a blur of anxiety and self-doubt. Ethan had always been a man who thrived on control, on the certainty that came from meticulously planning his every move. But now, with everything in his life hanging in the balance, control felt like a distant dream. His company, the empire he had spent years building, was slipping through his fingers, and he wasn't sure if he could stop the collapse. The board was restless, questioning his commitment to the company, while his personal life, his children, his fractured relationship with Aliyah, his quiet longing for a future with them, was pulling him in directions he didn't know how to navigate. He sat in his office, staring at the documents in front of him. But none of it made sense anymore. The figures, the profit margins, the board meetings. They all felt hollow. The company that had once been his everything was now just a symbol of the emptiness he felt inside. It was as if everything that had defined him for so long no longer mattered. And in the silence that followed, there was a nagging question that Ethan couldn't escape. What if he had made the wrong choice? His father's voice still echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Ethan had always been his father's son, always striving to live up to expectations that were impossible to meet. And now, after all these years, he was finally breaking free, trying to carve out a path for himself. A path that didn't require approval from anyone else, but the cost of that freedom was becoming clearer by the day. As he sat at his desk, his mind wandered back to the night of the press conference, the moment when he had made the decision to reveal the truth about his family. In that moment, there had been a flicker of hope. Hope that he could fix everything. Hope that Aliyah, Amir, and Elijah would see him for the man he was becoming, not the man he had been. But now, as the weight of the world pressed down on him, Ethan wasn't so sure anymore. He had promised them a better life, but the truth was, he had no idea how to give it to them. He was still learning how to be their father, still learning how to be present in their lives after all these years of absence. And with Aliyah's growing distance, the weight of his failure was unbearable. Aliyah, the girl who once looked at him with such trust in her eyes, now barely spoke to him. Her silence was a constant reminder of the years he had lost, years that could never be reclaimed. He had been too busy, too consumed by the world of wealth and power to see what was slipping through his fingers. And now Aliyah's walls were taller than ever. She didn't want his help, didn't want his apologies, and certainly didn't want his love. She had her own life, her own world that didn't include him, and Ethan couldn't fault her for that. He had failed her, and there was no easy way to undo the damage. It was the mornings that were the hardest, when the house was still quiet, and the only sound was the soft rustle of the wind against the windows. Aliyah would sneak downstairs, her face as guarded as always, her eyes avoiding his. She would sit at the breakfast table, picking at her food, her mind seemingly miles away. Ethan tried to engage her, to start a conversation, but it was always met with a stiff silence. Her coldness was like a knife to his heart. He had known it would take time, but he didn't realize how painful it would be. And then there was Amir. At 11, Amir was still young enough to cling to the hope that his father would stay. He would run to Ethan when he came home, his smile wide, his eyes filled with unconditional love. He didn't care about the past. He didn't care about the mistakes Ethan had made. All he cared about was the fact that his father was there. And in those moments, Ethan felt like he was truly a part of something, like he could still make a difference. But even Amir wasn't immune to the tension in the air. Ethan could see the weight of it on his son's face, could see the way his innocent joy had started to fade. Just a little. It was as if the storm that raged in Ethan's heart was starting to seep into their lives, turning every moment of happiness into something fragile, something temporary. And then there was Elijah, the baby of the family, who still held on to the belief that life could be simple, that love could be unconditional. He would climb into Ethan's lap, his small arms wrapped around him, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan could forget the chaos. But even Elijah's innocence couldn't shield him from the tension. Ethan could see it in the way the child would cling to him, sensing the change in the air. It was only a matter of time before the storm would break. But the biggest storm of all was one that Ethan hadn't seen coming: the unraveling of his company. He had tried to keep it together, had tried to balance the demands of work with his commitment to his family, but it was becoming impossible. The board was becoming more vocal in their concerns, questioning his ability to lead with such personal distractions. Rumors were swirling about his priorities, and investors were starting to pull back. The company that had once been his lifeline, the thing that had defined him, was now a source of constant stress. He had always prided himself on his ability to control everything, to be the one who made the tough decisions. But now, in the face of this growing crisis, he was unsure. What was the point of all this success if it meant losing his family? What was the point of building an empire if the people he loved couldn't be a part of it? And then, just as he was beginning to question everything, his phone rang. It was his lawyer. The news she delivered shattered everything. "Ethan," she said, her voice tight, "I need you to prepare yourself. There's a lawsuit coming your way, one that could cost you everything." The words hit him like a freight train. His father had made his move. The battle for control of the company had begun, and his father wasn't going to let Ethan walk away from it. The board was already in his corner, and the media would soon follow. Ethan's worst fear had come true. He was about to lose everything: his company, his family, his future. All of it was slipping through his fingers. The storm that had been brewing for months was finally here, and there was no telling how much destruction it would cause. Ethan stood in his office, staring out the window, the weight of the world pressing down on him. He had promised Aliyah, Amir, and Elijah that he would fight for them. But now it felt like everything was falling apart. Could he really protect them from the fallout? Could he rebuild his life? Or was he destined to lose everything he had worked so hard for? The phone call with his lawyer had left Ethan in a daze, his mind swirling with the weight of the news. The lawsuit was no longer a distant threat. It was a reality, and it was heading straight for him with the force of a freight train. His father's words echoed in his ears, a harsh reminder of the war that had just begun. The board was already aligning with his father, and the media vultures were circling. The company that had once been his pride, the thing that had defined him for so long, was slipping through his fingers. He had always been a man who lived for control, who thrived on the certainty that came with having everything planned, everything mapped out. But now, everything he had worked for seemed to be unraveling, as though it were a house of cards, and all it took was one gust of wind to bring it all down. The press was already catching wind of the lawsuit, and with it came a barrage of the questions he wasn't prepared to answer. As much as he tried to push it out of his mind, the pressure kept building, suffocating him. Every decision felt like it could be the one that would push him over the edge. He couldn't afford to lose everything he had worked for. But as the days dragged on, and the weight of his family's silence continued to press down on him, Ethan began to wonder if it was all worth it. What had he sacrificed to get here? What had he given up in pursuit of success? His father's expectations had always loomed over him, dictating his every move, his every decision. But in that moment, Ethan realized that the cost of living for someone else's approval was far too high. And then there were his children. Amir, still full of hope, still reaching out to him every day, wanting to connect, wanting to believe that his father would be there for him, no matter what. Elijah, his baby, the innocent one who didn't understand the weight of the world, but somehow still sensed the tension in the air, still clung to him as if he were the only thing holding their world together. And Aliyah, the girl he had hurt the most, the one who had built walls so high that Ethan didn't know if they could ever come down. She was the one who had been the hardest to reach, the one who seemed the most distant, and the one who, in many ways, he felt he had failed the most. Every time he looked at her, he saw the girl she had been, full of love, full of trust, and the woman she had become, filled with so much pain, so much hurt. Aliyah's silence was louder than any words could ever be. She didn't want his apologies. She didn't want his pity. She didn't want his promises. She wanted him to be there when it mattered, and he had failed her. Ethan sat in his office late that night, staring at the blank screen of his laptop. The numbers, the reports, the media inquiries, they all seemed like meaningless noise. The weight of the lawsuit, the pressure from the board, the expectations of his father. None of it mattered anymore. What mattered was his children, his family. He had tried so hard to juggle everything, to be the man who could do it all, who could be both a successful businessman and a present father. But the truth was, he couldn't. Not anymore. It was then that he made the decision, the one that would change everything. Ethan stood up from his desk, his hands trembling as he reached for his coat. He had to leave the office, had to clear his head, had to make sense of it all. The weight of his choices had been suffocating. But now, there was only one thing that mattered. He needed to be with his children. No more distractions, no more empty promises. They were the ones who had been waiting for him, the ones who had been longing for his attention, his love, and he had to fight for them. As he left the office, the night air was cool against his skin, the distant hum of the city filling his ears. He walked the streets, not really knowing where he was going, just needing to escape the chaos for a while. But it wasn't long before his thoughts returned to Aaliyah. She had been so cold, so distant, and Ethan couldn't help but feel the pang of guilt that came with her silence. He had failed her, and now he wasn't sure if there was anything he could do to make it right. He thought of the last time they had spoken, the hurt in her eyes, the way she had looked at him as though he were a stranger. But he couldn't give up on her. He couldn't give up on any of them. Ethan's footsteps grew faster as the thought of losing them all became unbearable. The city around him seemed to blur, the noise fading as he was consumed by the weight of his decision. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know if the lawsuit would destroy him, didn't know if the board would oust him. But what he did know was that he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try to fix things with his family. By the time he reached home, the exhaustion was beginning to settle in. But the urgency inside him hadn't faded. He needed to talk to Aaliyah, needed to find a way to break through the walls she had built. He entered the house quietly, the familiar silence greeting him as he made his way through the hallway. He found Amir in the living room, playing with a toy car, but Aaliyah was nowhere to be seen. "Hey, bud," Ethan said softly, kneeling down beside Amir. "How's it going?" Amir looked up, his face lighting up with a smile. "Dad, you're home!" He jumped up and ran to Ethan, wrapping his arms around him. For a moment, Ethan held his son close, feeling the warmth of his love and the innocence that Amir still clung to. But then, his gaze shifted to the hallway, searching for Aaliyah. She wasn't there. "Where's your sister?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Amir's smile faded slightly. "She's upstairs. She doesn't want to talk." Ethan's heart sank. He had known this was coming, had known that Aaliyah's walls wouldn't come down easily. But it still hurt to hear the words. "Okay," he said softly. "Thanks, buddy. I'm going to talk to her." He stood up, walking slowly up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached her door, he paused. He wasn't sure what to expect, wasn't sure if she would even let him in. But he had to try. He knocked lightly, his heart racing. "Aaliyah," he called softly. "Could we talk?" For a long moment, there was only silence. And then, just as Ethan was about to turn away, the door creaked open. Aaliyah stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Her eyes met his for the first time in days, and in them, Ethan saw the hurt, the confusion, the walls she had built to protect herself from the father who had failed her. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry for everything. I'm not perfect, and I can't change the past. But I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." The words hung in the air, a fragile promise that Ethan wasn't sure he could keep. But it was all he had to offer. Aaliyah looked at him for a long time, her face softening ever so slightly. And then, to Ethan's surprise, she stepped back and opened the door fully. "Come in," she said quietly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. The door to Aaliyah's room creaked softly as Ethan stepped inside, his heart still racing from the vulnerability of the moment. As he crossed the threshold, he could sense the tension in the air, a charged silence that seemed to hang heavy between them. Aaliyah had stepped back, allowing him into her space, but Ethan wasn't foolish enough to think this was an invitation for easy reconciliation. Her eyes were still guarded, but they weren't as cold as they had been the last few days. There was a crack in the wall, just a small one, but it was there. That alone gave Ethan hope, a fragile hope that he clung to like a lifeline in a storm. He stepped further into the room, glancing at the scattered books and photographs that lined the shelves, memories of a life he had been absent from for far too long. He had missed so much. He didn't want to miss any more. He paused before Aaliyah, not sure what to say. There was no perfect apology, no magic words that would heal the wounds he had inflicted on her over the years. But he had to try. He had to give her the truth. "Aaliyah, I know I can't undo the past," he began, his voice thick with emotion, the weight of his failures and regrets pressing down on him. "I've been selfish, and I've hurt you in ways I'll never be able to take back. But I want you to know something. I'm here now. I'm not leaving. I'm going to fight for us." Aaliyah looked at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak right away, and Ethan's heart tightened in his chest. He wasn't sure if she was willing to forgive him, or if she even wanted to. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Aaliyah's face softened. She crossed her arms, but not in anger, more as if she were trying to protect herself from the vulnerability of the moment. "You don't get to just walk back into our lives, Ethan," she said quietly, her voice steady but laced with pain. "You don't get to just say you're here now and expect everything to be okay." Her words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He deserved them. He knew he did, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. "I don't expect it to be okay," he replied, his voice breaking slightly. "I know it's going to take time, and I'm willing to wait. I just need you to know that I'm here for you, whether you want me to be or not." Aaliyah's eyes flickered briefly, a glimmer of something softening in their depths. But she didn't speak. Instead, she just nodded, slowly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. Ethan felt his breath catch in his chest. He didn't know if this was enough to heal the damage he had done, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe it could be. Maybe there was hope for them after all. "I know I've missed so much of your life," he continued, stepping closer. "I can't change that, but I want to be here now. For you, for Amir, for Elijah. I want to be the father you deserve." Aaliyah's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment Ethan thought she might shut him out again. But then, without warning, she spoke, her voice small but steady. "You have to earn it, Ethan," she said softly. "You can't just say things and expect me to believe you. You have to show me you mean it. Show me that you're not just here because you feel guilty or because you have nothing else left. Show me that you really want this." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. "I will. I swear I will. I've spent so long running from everything that mattered. But not anymore. I'm done running." There was a long pause, and then Aaliyah met his eyes, her gaze searching his face for the sincerity she needed to see. Finally, she nodded again, her arms uncrossing. "We'll see," she said quietly. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. And that was all Ethan could ask for. He didn't know what the future held, or if things would ever go back to the way they were. But in that moment, he felt a flicker of hope, a small but powerful reminder that love could still heal, that time could still repair the cracks that had formed over the years. He had a long way to go, but he wasn't giving up. Not on Aaliyah, not on Amir, and not on Elijah. As Ethan left Aaliyah's room, he felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. He still had a long road ahead. There was still so much to fix, so many wounds to heal. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was finally heading in the right direction. And then, as if the universe was signaling him toward the next step, Ethan heard a small voice from the living room. "Dad." It was Amir, his face bright with hope as he looked up from the couch. "Can we play? I missed you." The innocence in Amir's voice was enough to break Ethan's heart. He hadn't been there for so many of these moments, so many of these little milestones that he could never get back. But now he had a chance to make things right. He walked over to Amir, his heart swelling with emotion. "Of course, buddy," he said softly, ruffling Amir's hair. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." As they sat together on the floor, playing with toys and laughing, Ethan allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a future. One where his children could heal, where his mistakes could be forgiven, and where love could bridge the gap between the past and the present. Outside the window, the sky had cleared, the rain finally stopping as the first rays of sunlight began to break through the clouds. It felt symbolic, a sign that the storm had passed. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would be hard days ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a sense of hope that he hadn't known he was capable of. He had a second chance, and he was going to make the most of it, for himself, for Aaliyah, for Amir, and for Elijah. He wasn't sure what the future would look like, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let go of them again. He had fought too hard to get here, and he would continue to fight for the family he loved, no matter what it took. As the sound of Amir's laughter filled the room, and the warmth of Elijah's small hands clung to his side, Ethan finally allowed himself to relax. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.